From an early age, we are taught to walk together, to follow rules, imitate our elders, respect traditions, and repeat ideas we don't always understand. Being accepted becomes a kind of silent reward, the comfort of belonging. In this context, the herd is not just a metaphor, it's a psychological reality, a protective structure that offers direction, meaning, and recognition. Living the way everyone else lives doesn't require courage. It requires adaptation, and the better we adapt, the more we're praised. Nietzsche saw in this a profound risk. When belonging becomes more important than truth, thinking ceases to be an act of freedom and turns into a conditioned reflex. The herd offers safety, but at a high cost. It demands silence in the face of lies, conformity in the face of injustice, neutrality where there should be conviction. And anyone who dares to think outside that structure soon realizes that freedom, at first, doesn't taste like lightness. It carries the weight of abandonment. Leaving the herd doesn't simply mean disagreeing. It means breaking with the deepest bond of collective existence, the need for recognition. It means enduring the strange looks, the judgment that comes not from enemies, but from those who once called you a brother. Nietzsche understood that the greatest prison isn't built from outside walls, but from the fear of finding yourself alone when everyone turns their back on you. And that's why so few have the courage to take that first step, because most have grown used to confusing acceptance with worth, obedience with virtue, and repetition with wisdom. The break, then, doesn't begin with a rebellious act, but with the quiet exhaustion of someone who can no longer live according to voices that aren't their own. And from that inner weariness, something begins to shift. What once seemed like shelter now reveals itself as a cage. And that awakening, painful as it may be, marks the beginning of a new way of living, one that no longer fits within the morality of the herd. There is a kind of comfort that doesn't warm, it only numbs. It's the comfort of obedience, the kind disguised as virtue. The herd doesn't just expect you to walk in the same direction. It expects you to believe that direction is good, just and moral. And for many, that's enough. As long as there's the feeling of being on the right side, of acting out of goodness, it hardly matters whether that goodness is real or just a collective illusion. Nietzsche warned of this trap. Obedience, once institutionalized as virtue, stops being a conscious choice and becomes an invisible programming. You don't stay silent out of fear, but because you believe silence is noble. You don't challenge anything out of laziness, but because you think questioning is disrespectful. And so, day by day, a domesticated morality takes shape, one that rewards those who submit, who repeat, who erase themselves without even noticing. The illusion of virtue is the cement of the herd. It builds an artificial peace, where no one raises their voice, but everyone carries a hidden resentment, where no one seems to wish harm, but everyone closes their eyes when harm appears. And anyone who tries to break that illusion is quickly seen as a threat, not because they are truly dangerous, but because they shake the established order, the one built on appearances, slogans, and a concept of good that never confronts reality. For Nietzsche, the real danger doesn't lie in those who consciously do wrong, but in those who obey without thinking, because they don't realize the damage they cause. They believe they're doing the right thing, when in reality, they're just upholding a structure that keeps them from growing. The morality of the herd is comfortable because it avoids conflict, but that's exactly what makes it fragile. It can't withstand the friction of truth, and it's at this point that many begin to awaken. They realize that the virtue they were taught is often just fear dressed up in pretty words, that the respect they learned is actually imposed silence, and that the peace so highly valued is merely the absence of courage, the courage to face reality, even when it shatters our most cherished certainties. When virtue becomes an obligation, guilt becomes the method. That's how the herd molds its members, not just to follow the established order, but to feel ashamed of any impulse that challenges it. In this context, guilt isn't genuine remorse. It's an internal, silent punishment that paralyzes the spirit before it even moves towards something new. Nietzsche saw this mechanism with brutal clarity. To him, guilt doesn't stem from a moral failure, but from the internalization of a domination structure. It wasn't introduced to purify the soul. It was meant to tame it. When someone begins to think for themselves, the first barrier they face isn't external. It's the feeling of betraying something: family, religion, tradition, community. And that hesitation alone can be enough to stop them. What the herd calls conscience, Nietzsche often called conditioning. Not because real values don't exist, but because most people never choose them authentically. They're inherited, imposed, absorbed like sacred rules that can't be touched. And so, guilt becomes the invisible guard of a moral prison. It prevents thought from crossing the boundaries of the norm. This is one of the greatest obstacles for those who begin to wake up. It's not enough to see what's wrong. You have to bear the weight of carrying that clarity, because seeing the world differently, thinking beyond conventions, acting against collective commandments, all of that creates a deep sense of not belonging. And that pain is what makes many turn back, not because they changed their minds, but because they couldn't carry the burden of guilt. The cruelest part is that the herd no longer needs to watch someone who has internalized guilt. That person polices themselves, censors themselves, represses themselves. The punishment comes from within, disguised as virtue, and it's only when this mechanism is exposed that it can start to be dismantled. The courage to leave the herd inevitably requires killing that inherited guilt, not with arrogance, but with awareness, because true freedom doesn't exist while your conscience is ruled by values you never chose with a fully awakened heart. When words become formulas, thought stops being creation and becomes repetition. This is what Nietzsche noticed as he observed the language of the majority. A moral vocabulary, prepackaged, chewed up, harmless, circulating among people like a token of mutual approval. Those who speak like the herd think like the herd, and more than that, feel like the herd, because the words we use shape not only our ideas, but our very way of seeing the world. Collective language, instead of freeing, often traps. It defines what's good, what's ugly, what's acceptable. And anyone who dares to say something different is quickly labeled insensitive, arrogant, or dangerous. Common discourse has become a safe space, but a shallow one. You're not allowed to say what unsettles, what challenges, what wounds, even if it's true. And so, thought is tamed before it even has the chance to be born. Nietzsche didn't write to please. He wrote to break things apart. His language was sharp, strange, filled with disturbing images, because he knew that true thought doesn't express itself in worn-out phrases. It is born from friction with reality, from the courage to name what no one else wants to see. But that takes solitude, because to break with the vocabulary of the majority is also to break with its affection, its protection, its acceptance. This hollowing out of thought is what keeps the herd together. Words like love, justice, kindness, respect are repeated endlessly, but rarely lived deeply. They work more as stamps of belonging than as real commitments. And anyone who questions the meaning of these words is quickly silenced. Not with arguments, but with outrage. Because thinking outside the common language is, for the herd, a threat to the entire order of things. This is the point where silence begins to take on a new value, not the silence of submission, but the silence of someone who no longer finds a place to exist within collective language. Those who begin to see that the dominant vocabulary is exhausted must find another way to speak, or perhaps a new way to remain silent. And it's exactly in this rupture that the next movement reveals itself. The inevitable solitude of the one who took the first step beyond. No rupture happens without leaving behind a piece of belonging. The first step outside the herd is not a loud act of rebellion, but a new kind of silence that begins to form within. It's when a person realizes that something no longer fits, that the words no longer convince, that the promises of the collective sound empty. And when they try to pull away, they don't find support, they find absence. Nietzsche knew that the path of authenticity is marked by inevitable solitude, not the romantic solitude of those who choose distance, but the raw solitude of those who can no longer pretend. The first step beyond the herd is, more often than not, invisible to others, but deeply felt by the one who takes it. It's that moment when someone, even while surrounded, no longer feels accompanied, even while hearing voices, no longer feels heard, even while being seen, no longer feels recognized. This is one of the hardest pains to bear, because the break begins before there's a new place to belong to. You leave behind the old language, the inherited morality, the solidified certainties, but you don't yet have a new foundation, only a ground that crumbles beneath your feet. And in that in-between, the temptation to return is great, to be accepted again, to fit in again, to fall silent again, just to avoid discomfort. But those who have tasted clarity, no matter how bitter it may be, rarely forget it. The discomfort of seeing the world with your own eyes is preferable to the comfort of remaining blind. And it's this quiet force that sustains the first step. Not a certainty, but a refusal. A refusal to keep living under rules that suffocate. A refusal to betray your own conscience, just to keep the role of the good child, the good citizen, the good person. The first step is not an arrival. It's the beginning of a desert. But in that desert, paradoxically, something begins to bloom. A different kind of clarity, a fuller presence. And that's when the individual begins to realize that they're not just different, they've become disruptive. Not because they attack, but because their very existence is now a challenge to those who remain inside. And it's this realization that opens the door to the hostility that will follow. The herd doesn't react with violence to the one who threatens it with weapons. It reacts with violence to the one who threatens it with clarity. And the greatest clarity of all is the one that shows itself in someone who no longer needs to be accepted. When a person begins to think independently, to abandon moral formulas, to reject the collective theatre, they become, even in silence, an affront to the established order. And those who call themselves good, decent, virtuous, are the first to attack. Nietzsche observed this mechanism with precision. The herd's goodness is fragile. It constantly needs confirmation. It needs to be recognized, applauded, protected from any gaze that might expose it. And when someone, simply through the way they live, shows that this so-called goodness might be a farce, the reaction is immediate. Accusation, exclusion, the attempt to discredit. It doesn't matter how kind that person was before. Once they break away, they become dangerous. Being hated by the good is not a tragedy. It's almost a rite of passage. It's the sign that you no longer play the game. You no longer bow to the fear of appearing wrong. You no longer sell yourself for acceptance. And that, to those still dependent on others' approval, is unbearable, because the presence of someone who is free reveals the prison everyone else is still in. No one can stand for long the reflection of what they could have been, but chose not to be. The hostility that emerges in these moments isn't rational. It comes from the collective instinct of self-preservation. The herd senses when one of its own is becoming too strange, too authentic, too free, and then it pushes them out, not out of malice, but out of self-defense. Collective morality, when threatened, reveals its cruelest side. It punishes those who dare to be different, and it does so in the name of justice, of goodness, of order. But what the good call justice, Nietzsche often identified as resentment, that bitter feeling of someone who never had the courage to live by their own will, and now can't stand seeing someone else do it in front of their eyes. It's this resentment that wears moral masks, that speaks in tones of outrage, that hides behind words like respect, decency, social responsibility. Knowing this doesn't make exclusion any easier, but it does make the process clearer. And by understanding that the hatred of the good is, in truth, a reaction of fear and envy, the individual who breaks away from the herd can move forward with more resolve, because they are no longer fighting against people, they are passing through the shadows that freedom always casts. Silence isn't always the absence of a response. Sometimes, it's the most complete answer one can give. Nietzsche saw this clearly. There's a kind of silence born from strength, from clarity, and from the refusal to keep explaining what can only be lived. Those who no longer need to prove anything to others fall silent, not out of resignation, but out of maturity. This silence is not empty. It carries within it the decision to no longer bow to the expectations of others. It's the silence of someone who has understood that no explanation will ever be enough for those unwilling to understand. Of someone who has realized that the constant effort to be accepted is often a subtle form of self-betrayal. And so, they choose to stop translating their soul into a language the world never truly wanted to hear. That choice, though it may appear cold on the outside, is deeply sensitive within. Because only those who have genuinely tried to be understood know the exhaustion it brings. Only those who've been wounded while trying to build bridges with words know how much it hurts to be misunderstood, even with the best intentions. The silence that follows isn't indifference, it's care. It's the protection of one's own truth. Nietzsche didn't praise silence for its own sake, but as an expression of a strength that no longer feeds on reaction. It's the silence of someone who's no longer willing to burn their own light, trying to illuminate places that refuse to see. Of someone who realizes that, at times, silence is the only way to keep their integrity alive. And yet, that silence is unsettling because it reveals. It highlights the contrast between the noise of the majority and the depth of someone who no longer needs to justify themselves. It disrupts the automatic flow of repetition, creates discomfort, dismantles defenses. That's why it's so powerful. It doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. It's from this dense and deliberate silence that a new inner space begins to emerge. A space where freedom no longer depends on others' responses, but on loyalty to what has become non-negotiable. And in that space, far from the noise of approval and the need to be understood, something rare begins to take shape. The possibility of creating new paths, new words, and perhaps new values. Not every response is freedom. More often than not, reacting is just a refined way of staying trapped. The herd teaches that value lies in answering, in justifying yourself, in explaining every move, every choice. But Nietzsche warns us of the danger in that. Someone who reacts constantly is still living under the control of others. Their peace depends on someone else's opinion. Their actions are born from external provocation. Their identity needs validation. Reactivity is a habit of an unrefined mind, an impulse that looks like strength but actually reveals insecurity. When someone accuses us and we feel the need to prove something, it's a sign we're still chained to the collective gaze. When someone judges us and we want to defend ourselves, it shows we're still seeking acceptance. True freedom begins when there's no longer a need to respond, not out of contempt, but out of calm. Nietzsche proposed that the truly authentic individual is not the one who wins debates, but the one who no longer needs to have them. They don't react because they're no longer playing the same game. They seek neither applause nor confrontation. They simply move forward, attentive, silent, grounded in their own values. And that stance is more unsettling than 1,000 arguments, because it is presence, a presence that neither bows nor explains itself. This kind of strength isn't built through speeches, but in the silence of inner consistency. It's cultivated in solitude, in the nights when everything seems to fall apart, in the days when no one understands. Little by little, those who stop reacting begin to see that what once felt urgent was, in fact, a distraction, that the noise of others no longer needs to dictate their direction. And so, gradually, a new way of existing begins to form, a way that doesn't deny the world, but no longer depends on it, where serenity isn't apathy and silence isn't absence. It's at this point that the act of remaining silent becomes more powerful than any explanation. And it's this silence, dense and calm, that makes room for what comes next. Breaking with the herd isn't just an act of refusal. Above all, it's an opening to creation. Nietzsche knew that rejecting collective morality wasn't enough. You also needed the courage to create a new way of living, thinking, and feeling. A life outside the norm demands far more than criticism. It demands responsibility. Because once you stop following ready-made paths, there's no one left to tell you what's right or wrong. Everything has to be reinvented from within. That's the most demanding part of freedom. As long as an individual only rejects what was imposed, they're still tied to what they're fighting against. But when they begin creating their own values, the break is real. Not to be different, but to be authentic. Their actions start to emerge from their own awareness, not from others' expectations. Their choices stop being reactions and become affirmations. Nietzsche called this movement transvaluation. It's the replacement of inherited values, based on guilt, fear, and submission, with values born from facing reality. It's not about imposing a new rule on the world, but about finding a way of living that aligns with one's own truth, a truth that doesn't need to be universal or applauded. It only needs to be real for the one who lives it. But that creation is quiet. It doesn't happen in speeches, but in decisions, in small acts of letting go, in daily choices that begin shaping a different kind of life. New values don't need promotion. They reveal themselves in the way someone walks, looks, acts, endures. They're felt before they're spoken. Yet, creating new values doesn't mean living without limits. It means building, with firmness and sensitivity, a personal ethic that doesn't rely on the world's approval. It means transforming solitude into clarity and exclusion into foundation. It's letting life shift from being a field of obedience into an expression of conscious presence. And from that presence, a new kind of strength begins to emerge. Not the strength of one who dominates, but of one who no longer needs to be led. A quiet strength that doesn't demand explanations, because its very existence is already a principle. And it's that strength that begins to appear in those who choose to keep going, even after everything, even on the outside, even alone. Few can bear freedom because it demands a heavy price, the absence of guarantees. Those who walk alone no longer have the applause of the majority, nor the comfort of a well-trodden road. Everything is a solitary construction, every step a choice, every choice a risk. But it's on that uncertain ground that strength begins to reveal itself. Not the strength of rigidity, but of persistence, of continuing, even when everything around suggests you shouldn't. Nietzsche didn't romanticize solitude, but he recognized its necessity. Authentic thought is born in the absence of external voices. Integrity in the refusal to shape oneself just to please. And freedom in the courage to face one's own fragility without outsourcing responsibility. Walking alone is not a display of pride. It's an act of loyalty to what has become too essential to be compromised. To the eyes of the herd, this kind of existence may seem arrogant or cold, but it's not distance out of contempt. It's withdrawal for survival. Those who no longer fit the old molds need enough silence to truly hear themselves. And that requires stepping away, not to hide, but to rebuild. Because there are truths that only emerge when the noise finally stops. This path, however, comes with its dangers. Prolonged isolation can turn clarity into a burden. It can feed resentment or transform freedom into exile. That's why Nietzsche never proposed isolation as the destination, but as a passage, a necessary time to rebuild with strength, to understand that being alone is not the same as being abandoned. It's having the courage to uphold your own path even without an audience. It's in this process that walking takes on a new rhythm. Your steps are no longer driven by the urgency to prove yourself, but by the calm of someone who knows their direction. The gaze no longer seeks approval, but inner recognition. And even if, on the outside, the journey seems quiet, on the inside, it is full, because every gesture, every refusal, every word spoken or left unsaid is rooted in something real. This is the kind of strength that doesn't shout, that doesn't impose, but that gradually transforms the way of being in the world. And it is from this serene presence that a new figure begins to emerge. A figure Nietzsche described with intensity and awe. Someone who not only left the herd, but created a new center of gravity. Someone who no longer needs to be led, because they have become their own guide. Nietzsche wasn't speaking of an unattainable ideal when he described the Overman, the Übermensch. He was speaking of a rare but real possibility. A human being who has not only freed themselves from the herd, but who has also transcended the need to confront it. Someone who no longer needs to prove their difference because it's already embodied in every action, in every silent choice, in every deliberate absence. The Overman doesn't live against the world, but above its invisible pressures. He isn't driven by rebellion, but by creation. His morality is no longer inherited or imposed. It's built from his own vision, his solitary experience, his loyalty to what lives within him. He doesn't seek followers, nor does he need to be understood by everyone. His strength lies in needing no applause. Nietzsche didn't propose an authoritarian or distant figure, but an awakened consciousness that stands on its own. The Overman is not someone who submits to moral theater, but neither does he seek revenge against it. He simply walks with serenity along the path he has discovered to be true. And that is precisely what makes him incomprehensible to many, because his presence exposes the mediocrity of ready-made formulas without ever attacking them. This state isn't reached all at once. It is built in the ruins of an old identity, after losing one's place in the herd and before finding a new inner axis. It's a process of emptying out and rebuilding, and only those who had the courage to face that emptiness without fleeing can reach this new way of being, a way that is silent, grounded, and profoundly free. Leaving the herd is not a gesture of contempt toward others, but one of loyalty to oneself. It's the recognition that most of the ideas that shaped us were not choices. They were conventions, and continuing to follow those conventions when they no longer make sense is a disguised form of surrender. Nietzsche didn't write for the complacent. He wrote for the restless, for those who feel something is deeply wrong beneath the surface of order, and who have the courage to follow that intuition wherever it leads. That courage is not loud. It doesn't appear in fiery speeches or theatrical gestures. It manifests in the silence of those who refuse to betray their own conscience any longer, in those who can endure solitude without becoming bitter, in those who keep going, even without guarantees, out of loyalty to something they don't yet know how to name, but already feel is true. The herd will always offer shelter, but never freedom. It welcomes you as long as you bow, as long as you yield, as long as you slowly erase yourself to continue belonging. And some choose that, but others, at some point, realize the cost is too high, that living this way is mere survival, and that survival is not enough. For them, Nietzsche offers not an easy path, but a courageous clarity. The clarity that we are not born free, we become free, and that becoming requires rupture, loss, and silence. But in the end, what once felt like loss reveals itself as gain, because what is gained cannot be measured by anyone else's eyes. It's a kind of integrity that only those who have touched the depths of their soul can recognize. This is the courage to leave the herd, not to isolate from the world, but to finally belong to it in an honest way, with open eyes, with a mind of your own, with the serenity of someone who walks alone, but is not lost.